Hi everyone, Jim and Jody from the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, back on the field. Jody, say hi to everyone.
Hello everyone.
And we have a special bonus today. Jody is actually going to get some time in front of the camera, so we know that'll be a big hit with all of Jody's fans out there, and we know who you are, I think. So we're recording this on the 160th anniversary of the Lincoln Assassination, and what we thought we would do is introduce you to a specific participant at the Battle of Gettysburg, Lewis Powell from the 2nd Florida, who many of you know was involved in the assassination. Well, we're going to start by talking about what he did at Gettysburg, how he got to Gettysburg, and because this is a particularly interesting topic to Jody, she's going to tell us more about Powell. We're starting this series on West Confederate Avenue. Behind me is the Florida State Monument. Now, when we give battlefield tours, I often find that people are frequently surprised to see and hear that Florida was one of the states at Gettysburg representing and fighting in the Army of Northern Virginia. Yes, folks, Florida is a southern state. Florida was founded as a slaveholding state in the 1840s, and when the Civil War broke out, they were actually the third state to secede from the Union. Now, at Gettysburg, Florida was represented only by one brigade within the Army of Northern Virginia, and that was, guess what? We call them the Florida Brigade. The Florida Brigade should have been commanded at Gettysburg by Brigadier General Edward Perry, but Perry was sick with typhoid, so the brigade was instead led here by Colonel David Lang. Lang was a young guy, only something like 24, 25 years old. We'll talk more about Lang as we get into this video. But this is a small brigade, slightly more than 700 men on the field here. Jody, why don't we come on up and take a quick look at the monument itself. So we see 3 regiments, the 2nd, the 5th, and the 8th Florida. Because there were only 3 regiments here, you will see 3 stars on the monument and also 3 steps leading up to the monument itself. Both of those symbolically represent the 3 regiments that fought here. Now, despite the low numbers, and I don't know if you'll be able to read the inscription, you'll see the brigade suffered 445 casualties of the 700 men present for duty. That's a rough estimate, but the casualty rate, 62%, makes Florida the highest percentage loss of any state here on the battlefield at Gettysburg. And you may or may not have known that, but you do know that now. So as we said, one of the regiments here with the brigade is going to be the 2nd Florida. Lewis Powell. Jody's going to talk to us about Private Powell.
Lewis Thornton Powell was born in Alabama. He was the youngest of 4 sons and the 8th of 13 children. So basically, Lewis Powell is going to have an unremarkable childhood. He is described as his sisters, and this is post-death, as kind, loving, very nurturing and caring, and his nickname is Doc. He likes to take in animals, nurse them back to health, and with his family mostly being farmers, as a lot of people were back then, he tends the animals quite often. He will move with his parents to Florida, and they will be very active in the church. His father becomes a Baptist minister and a teacher. His sisters will say later that he wanted to become maybe a minister or perhaps a teacher, and that he was very popular with the ladies. Ooh. And this may be because of his good looks. He's probably the most photographed of the members of the assassins who were tried and found guilty. So after this what would seem very normal, very actually wonderful childhood, very positive, when the war hits, Lewis Powell decides to enlist, probably because his brothers enlisted, the 3 of the 4, and he is the youngest. He will follow them and enlist, and he is barely 17. He will enlist on May 30th, 1861 as a member of the Hamilton Blues.
So Jody, then would it be fair to say that Private Powell was what you would consider by Army of Northern Virginia standards a battle-hardened veteran by the time we get to Gettysburg in 1863?
I would say so. And then even though he's infantry, with his background as a farmer, he probably is a very good shot. He's seen several battles. He's been involved in a lot of conflicts, and he's noted to be a very good cavalryman, which we will see will come in later. He's infantry now, but again, a farmer, he's probably good on a horse.
Now, I know you've kind of described him as just a good old boy, but I've seen some indications that he really, by this point, did despise Yankees, and even something to the effect of he carried a Yankee skull with him. Do we know anything about that?
So, when he gets here to Gettysburg, he's only 19.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that kind of lore that is talked about him comes after the trial.
Okay.
So I'm not so sure how accurate it is. Some of his fellow members, as we'll see later in Mosby's Rangers, will say that he's an excellent shot. He's very quick and ready for the fight, and there's a quote that we'll give later. But I'm not sure that he despises Yankees yet. And if he does, I think we need to go back to his age and where he comes from. You know, he's a Confederate. He's only 19. He's very impressionable. And if anything, I think he's probably swept up in this adventure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the areas that he's from in Alabama and Florida are not very populated. He's kind of a farm boy, so now he's here seeing parts of the world that he's never seen before, and I think he's probably swept up like a lot of these younger soldiers.
Okay, very good. Let's go take a walk now up the Spangler farm lane, and let's see where the Florida Brigade, including the 2nd Florida, was posted.
Let's go.
So we're in the area of Spangler's Woods. West Confederate Avenue right now is somewhat behind me and to the left. As I'm panning the camera over in this direction, the Virginia State Memorial, which many of us know would be beyond this wood line and to my front left. Just panning through the woodlot because it was this general area where Lang's Florida Brigade was posted both on July 2nd, before going into combat, and in the early morning hours of July 3rd before getting their assignment in the ill-fated Pickett's Charge. Many of us know this area for being the general vicinity where Lewis Armstead's brigade was posted then later on July 3rd, but many people don't appreciate that the Florida Brigade also put a stake here, and so somewhere in this woodlot, no doubt Lewis Powell would have spent a little bit of time on the afternoon of the 2nd. We've moved out into the open a little bit, and the Spangler woodlot is behind me. Now, as I alluded to in the last video, probably most of us are more familiar with this ground behind me because of the starting point role that it plays for Pickett's division in Pickett's Charge on July 3rd. Particularly, Lewis Armstead's brigade would have started the charge from in front of the woods, kind of in this area over here on my far left in front. But did you know the Florida Brigade, Lang's brigade, also had a position over there? Now, Lang's brigade arrived on the battlefield on the evening of July 1st. They did not see any combat, and on the morning of July 2nd, they were moved into the area of the woodlot that you are looking at right now. Colonel Lang in his report described it as being moved to the right and formed a line behind an open field about 1 mile in width, the enemy being strongly entrenched upon the heights on the opposite side of the field. So as Jody's panning the camera to the right away from the woods, you might notice that the ground is starting to rise up. Jody, my finger was very popular in the wheat field videos.
We'll go back
let's try
to
that again. There it is. Our high quality production values here, folks.
Only the best.
So you see kind of the higher ground kind of rising up here, and the extreme right of the video, like way over here, would be the Emmitsburg Road. Jody, if you pan around, we might see a little bit of the fence line heading towards the Emmitsburg Road. We're not at the road yet, but you might even make out a little bit of the top of the Kadori farm.
Oh, there it is.
Right there. Just give you an idea of sort of where we are in
Oh,
relation
and it's
to that.
nicely captured by the fence. Look at that,
Yes,
guys.
very nice. Nice photography.
There you go.
So Lang's brigade was in the area of the woods. One of John Batchelder's July 2nd maps actually has the Florida Brigade in the morning posted in the woodlot itself. Now, Powell's 2nd Florida would have been on the left of their line, so that would have been over here. Am I on camera showing him over here,
Yes,
Jody?
there you are.
Doing the guide point?
Yep.
Okay. Powell's 2nd Florida would have been on the left of the line. Now, during the morning hours of July 2nd, Lang initially was going to move over to his right to support Cadmus Wilcox's brigade during Wilcox's firefight in Pitzer's Woods, but Wilcox came back and reported that he had repulsed the enemy and did not need any assistance. So according to Lang, here I received orders to hold my position without bringing on an engagement unnecessarily until General Longstreet could arrive on our right. Now, right? Now, as most of us know, Longstreet doesn't get into position until later in the afternoon and really doesn't begin his attack until about 4 o'clock. Going back then to Colonel Lang's report, he says that at about 5 p.m., I received an order from General Anderson, who would be the division commander, to the effect that General Longstreet was driving back the enemy's left and that Wilcox would advance whenever Longstreet's left advanced behind him. I was ordered to throw forward a strong line of skirmishers and advance with General Wilcox, holding all the ground the enemy yielded. Lang further goes on to say then that this particular advance began at around 6 p.m. So imagine now, folks, it's 6 p.m., July 2nd. Lang's Florida Brigade is going to start advancing out of the woods in this direction towards the Emmitsburg Road. Wilcox's brigade will be on their right, and they are hoping Longstreet is driving in the enemy left. But notice, folks, you really can't see a damn thing about that from the position that we're in right now, and certainly not from the position further back where our Floridians would have started from. In this next video segment, we've moved closer to the Emmitsburg Road. As the camera is looking initially, the Emmitsburg Road is right behind us, and we are right now panning towards, again, Spangler's Woods, where we started our adventure this morning. By the way, we know as the day is progressing here, it's getting really windy out there. Don't bust our stones for the sound quality of the video, please. Frankly, not enough people watch our videos yet for us to invest in a lot of high quality sound equipment. So anyways, now Jody is panning too fast towards the Emmitsburg Road. Slow down, Jody. She's panning towards the Emmitsburg Road. This would be the direction from which Lang's men advanced towards the Emmitsburg Road on the evening of July 2nd, with Powell's 2nd Florida on their left flank. So I'm going to return to Colonel Lang's report, and he says that at 6 p.m., General Wilcox, having begun to advance, which would be on the right or kind of behind the camera right now, Lang says, I moved forward, being met at the crest of the first hill with a murderous fire of grape, canister, and musketry. Moving forward at the double quick, the enemy fell back beyond their artillery, where they were attempting to rally when we reached the crest of the second hill. What I think Lang's describing is the way the ground goes uphill from the Spangler Wood position, and that second hill that he describes, I think, is the ridge line of the Emmitsburg Road, where a couple of batteries and Humphrey's division of the 3rd Corps would have been posted. Now, Humphrey's guys, as we know, run into problems. They're getting hit by Lang, by Wilcox, and Humphreys is getting hit on his left by Barksdale. So he's in kind of a world of hurt. And Lang continues that the enemy fell back beyond their artillery where they were attempting to rally when we reached the crest of the second hill. Seeing this, the men opened a galling fire upon the enemy, thickly strewing the ground with their killed and wounded. This threw them into confusion when we charged upon them with a yell, and they broke and fled in confusion into the woods and breastworks beyond, leaving 4 or 5 pieces of artillery as they departed. So Lang is describing the retreat of Humphrey's line from the Emmitsburg Road. And I'm going to pause there because you know what, folks? Things are looking pretty good for the Florida Brigade right now. I kind of can't wait to see how this is going to wrap up for them. Fingers crossed. The camera is now near the large red Nicholas Kadori barn, which is a prominent landmark on the battlefield. As the camera pans to the right, you'll see a big open field south of the barn. For a moment, the round tops will be visible on the horizon, but as the camera continues to pan to the right towards the Emmitsburg Road, I want you to really focus on this broad open field in the foreground. Lang's attack, with Wilcox on his right, will really stall out and lose momentum after they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, which is the fence line here, and now proceeded from camera right to left across the field, pursuing the fugitives from Humphrey's 3rd Corps Division. Lang's left, which would have included Powell's 2nd Florida, is probably getting hit by artillery fire from Weir's battery, as well as 2nd Corps regiments such as the 42nd New York and probably the 19th Massachusetts to their front left. Lang's biggest problem, though, was on his right, because as Wilcox's attack was stalling out due to federal counterattacks, Lang now had an exposed right, which would have been like his 8th Florida. Lang writes in his report that as he stopped to reform his scattered brigade before making a final rush towards Cemetery Ridge, Lang realized that Wilcox was starting to get pushed back and federal troops were in danger of working their way around and outflanking the right end of Lang's line. As Lang's brigade was forced to join in to a growing Confederate retreat back towards the Emmitsburg Road and back towards Seminary Ridge, they were probably threatened as well, I should mention, by a move from the 19th Maine. Again, primarily more, I think, against Lang's right center. But nevertheless, Lang's guys are starting to retreat back towards Seminary Ridge and ultimately near the position where they started the action at the beginning of the day. Lang will write in his report that, quote, during the course of the charge, quote, the brigade lost about 300 men killed, wounded, and missing, and I regret to state that while retreating, the colors of the 8th Florida Regiment were left upon the field. Now, one of the reasons why we're emphasizing what's happening on the left versus what's happening on the right, because as we'll talk about later, there's some debate over when Lewis Powell was wounded and captured. Many accounts, Powell biographers and Lincoln assassination buffs often tend to report that Powell was wounded and captured during this action on July 2nd. One of the things, though, we want to just consider in considering that date is the fact that in this particular case, Lang's right, the 8th Florida, went into the most problems. That's not to say that there was no fighting on the left, and it's very possible that Private Powell could have been wounded during this action on July 2nd. But before we come to an answer on that, we're going to want to look at their role in Pickett's charge on July 3rd and see what happens there. So that's what we're going to cover next. Let's talk a little bit about July 3rd and what we know today is Pickett's charge, or the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge, if you prefer. People sometimes forget that Wilcox's Alabama Brigade and Lang's Florida Brigade played a part in that charge as well. So we're on Hancock Avenue right now. The area that we're standing in would have been part of Freeman McGilvery's artillery line on July 3rd. And behind me, hopefully the camera can pick it up over my shoulder, is the Klingel Farm. We see the big tree, and beyond the tree along the Emmitsburg Road would be the White House and the Red Barn of Daniel Klingel. To me, one of the great tragedies of this is after suffering heavy casualties on July 2nd, Wilcox and Lang are going to be called upon to charge across much of the same ground again on July 3rd. Now, we're not doing a Pickett's charge video, but, July 3rd, Pickett's charge, Pickett's division is going to be sweeping towards the angle in the high water mark, which is more over here to my distant front left. However, Wilcox and Lang, after spending much of the morning posted near Confederate batteries along the Emmitsburg Road, Wilcox and Lang after Pickett's men had already started, were ordered by Longstreet to move forward and try to protect Pickett's right. Jody, if you can show me for a minute. I kind of want to get the idea of how the troops are moving
coming
here.
Back towards
coming
you.
back. Slowly. All right, so the problem is Pickett's guys are obliquing to the left towards Cemetery Ridge. In the smoke, the chaos, the confusion, the fog of war, the elapsed time, Wilcox and Lang's guys basically just go straight in or towards where we're standing right now. As far as we can tell, Powell's 2nd Florida is on the left, and as the Floridians are coming in this field towards us, they are hammered with, again, a murderous fire of canister, all kinds of artillery projectiles from McGilvery's batteries along this part of the line. As you've started to notice at this point, the wind is really kicking up on the battlefield and impacting our sound quality. So I'm going to kind of finish some thoughts on the July 3rd attack via voiceover here. Lang says in his report that I moved forward with Wilcox under a heavy fire from artillery, but without encountering any infantry until coming to the skirt of woods at the foot of the heights. Just before entering the woods, a heavy body of infantry advanced upon my left flank. What Lang is describing there is the movement by George Stannard's Vermont Brigade, who had already outflanked Pickett's right, and now basically they do a pivot out from Cemetery Ridge and now pivot face towards their left to now strike what would be the left flank of Lang's brigade coming in. And unfortunately, Powell's 2nd Florida is on the left end of that line. Lang continues, quote, "The noise of artillery and small arms was so deafening that it was impossible to make the voice heard, and the men were by this time so badly scattered in the bushes and among the rocks that it was impossible to make any movement to meet or check the enemy's advance. So we can't remain in this position, either unsupported, artillery playing upon us with grape and canister, which was certain annihilation." So as they had to do on July 2nd, Lang's brigade again is once again going to have to retreat back towards the Emmitsburg Road. Now Lang adds, and this is important to our Powell story, "I ordered a retreat, which, however, was not in time to save a large number of the 2nd Florida Infantry, together with their colors, from being cut off and captured by the flanking force on the left." So this goes back to what we said in the earlier video. There would seem to be some evidence that if Powell is a member of the 2nd Florida, the mass capture of a large portion of that regiment happened not on July 2nd, but on July 3rd. So you guys just want to kind of keep that in mind. Lang will go on, "We fell back to our artillery, we reformed our old line, and we remained here quietly until nightfall." So as we've said throughout this video, obviously heavy losses for Lang's Florida Brigade. Lang said in his report, quote, "The brigade went into action near 700 strong and lost 455 killed, wounded, and missing, including Major Moore of the 2nd Florida." Now also included in that total would have been Lewis Powell, who was shot in the wrist and wounded and captured, as we've said, either on July 2nd or July 3rd. Now, I think the 455 total casualty number is an imperfect number, particularly in terms of trying to measure the missing and captured of the regiment. But as we said at the beginning of this, that does translate into a 61% casualty rate. The 2nd Florida, of which Powell was a member, 242 men brought to the field, at least 106 casualties, which would be a 44% casualty rate. At this point, a weather front was clearly blowing in. Not a major storm, but a good-sized front with some clouds. Obviously, you've heard the wind, and we did get some rain immediately afterwards. So instead of finishing the story on the field, we had to grudgingly move indoors, where we're now going to more deep dive into the second half of Lewis Powell's story. we've moved inside to our state-of-the-art Battle of Gettysburg Podcast indoor studios. Jody, did you recover from the wind and the rain?
I did. Oh my goodness, they were, up to 50 miles an hour. See what we do for our fans.
Yes, yeah. And you know everybody's going to complain. Oh, that you need better microphones, you need wind shears. As I've said, folks, not enough of you watch these videos for us to invest in high quality equipment. So if you really want high quality equipment, we need more views. So help us
I
out there.
like to think of it as raw and authentic.
That's right. Raw enough. We are the Raw Gettysburg Podcast. Is that what that is?
Right.
All
That's
right, all
it.
right.
Yeah.
So we talked about the exploits of the Florida Brigade. On the battlefield, our friend Lewis Powell, 2nd Florida, has been wounded. Let's pick up Jody with the historical controversy
Okay.
surrounding when he was wounded and captured. Now, a caveat, this debate has been going on forever. It's not like we're going to pick up one book and say, oh, here's the answer. Um,
Right.
I have my reasons for thinking July 3rd, but as you know, you and I have talked about, a lot of historians and Powell biographers tend to opt for July 2nd. It doesn't really matter in the big historical picture, but this is what we do, right? We dive into the weeds. So,
That's
what do you
right. We like to dive in, separate things apart, unpack things,
unpack? Yes,
analyze it.
a lot to unpack in the Lewis Powell story.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. Um,
What's the
so
case for July 2nd?
so the case for July 2nd is that there are Confederate records that list him as a POW on July 2nd. Now, that said, I'm pretty sure things were very disorganized and a little hectic on July 2nd and 3rd. Um, the case for July 3rd is that he himself will tell his defense attorney, who is assigned to him very late on in his captivity, right before his trial, Captain William Doster, uh, and he will tell Reverend Gillette that he was part of Pickett's charge, and that's when he was wounded. Now, what happens is you have historians who will say, okay, let's just go by the POW records, and that keeps getting repeated.
Mhm.
But that's the only hard evidence. And then you have the man himself, his word, and you can look at his character and how valuable his word is two different ways. Well, see, here we have a man who tried to kill Seward and was part of the conspiracy. So how can we take his word? And then also, he does have several aliases. We only know of Payne, but he does have um, Longfellow's another one of his aliases. He has several. So, but during his trial, many people come forward and talk about how wonderful and positive and just what a gentleman and what his character was like. So then you have, which makes him even more interesting in those Floridians. They're so interesting because he gives off two characters. So do you believe somebody who's on basically death row and going to die saying he was part of Pickett's charge?
Yeah, okay. You know, and
I
this
don't
is
know.
why, well, and this is why our battlefield studies are helpful too. As we talked about on the battlefield, I'm a believer in the July 3rd scenario, and the primary reason that I'm a believer in that, we generally accept the 2nd Florida is on the left of the brigade line. On July 2nd, the right of the brigade line was the one that fell into trouble first, and the 8th Florida on the right in particular were the ones who were outflanked
Mhm.
and suffered a mass capture. But on July 3rd, it's a different story. The 2nd Florida, again on the left, on July 3rd, the left is the side that is outflanked. And Colonel Lang, the brigade commander, mentions in his report on July 3rd that there was a specific mass capture of a large number of the 2nd
Right.
Florida, including their colors. So, me being a good Gettysburg historian, I like to bias towards the July 3rd version. Again, at the end of the day, it's not that it matters. As I said on the battlefield, whether the wind picked it up or not, this is the bad battle for the Florida Brigade with
Mhm.
61% casualties in July 2nd, July 3rd, fighting over the same ground. Neither day goes well for them.
Well, and
But if
I think I agree with you now that I've been pondering this after
mhm.
we got out of the wind. And before I was, oh, it's July 2nd. But now that I've been pondering this and we were out on the battlefield, see, folks, that's why it's so important to get out on the battlefield and looking at those spots. Um, and if he was captured on the 2nd, where was he? What did he do? Because as we will find out later in his life, except for that last final day, he was a master of getting away, escaping, going to other places. So I don't know how effective things would have been on the 2nd. I don't know. I just buy July 3rd better.
Okay, so
There we go. We
yeah, we
we're
solved
determined.
nothing, but we gave people both sides of the argument. And
Right.
as always, right, we let you decide.
That's right.
How about afterwards? Let me guess. I'm guessing things are not going to go so well for Powell from this point forward. You want to pick up the story with whatever day he's captured?
Yeah, so what we do know for sure is we have Union records that place him at the 12th Corps Hospital on July 4th, which in my mind is when there's a little bit, things start to come together for both sides, a little more of a plan. And then he is moved from there to PA College. There are records that have them there, and there are eyewitness accounts that have them there.
Hmm.
And then eventually he will move to Letterman.
Okay.
Now, during this time, I guess fortunately or unfortunately for him, because his wounds are so much that he cannot fight, and we talked about he had a right wrist wound that could possibly have been broken. Either way, it was a gunshot wound, and he was in a sling. He could use his left arm. He was very attentive and caring and tended to doctor the wounded, and they let him. So again, there's that character and charisma. They were allowing him to walk freely and tend to Confederate wounded.
Okay.
Not once, not twice, but three times. Like, and they continue to allow him to do that. That's where things I feel like probably go astray. Just as yeah, he's 19, a group of women from Baltimore, and most are hardcore pro-secessionists,
As
pro-Southerners. They're coming
as
up to
many
take
of them
care of their
still
boys.
as many of them still are today.
Some, yeah.
Hmm.
And and I think we even talked about this in another episode way back when we were at the seminary, how some of the locals and even the Union officers and they were not excited about having these women from Baltimore come up. Nevertheless, they come up, and he develops a very close relationship with a Maggie Branson. Now, again, he's 19 and she's 30. We'll just pause there for a second. Uh, Apparently, she's also very charming and talks her way in and out of a lot of places and troubles. And she will stay in the area, and they're seen together. One of his there's a quote basically while he's on trial that he fell in love with his nurse at Gettysburg from Baltimore. Now, when he is transferred to West Building in Baltimore in September, she will follow.
Okay.
And again, that's where he gets in a bit of trouble. Um, because he doesn't stay there very long. And I can't say that I blame him. Several soldiers describe this as a quote, hell on earth. It's a basically like a warehouse kind of deal where they would take cotton and take the cotton and produce it into other items and whatever they do with cotton. So it's a warehouse. It's not an infirmary. It's not a prison. And apparently conditions are very bad. So he will not stay there long, maybe 2, 3 weeks. The actual date of the jailbreak is uncertain, but it is said that it has a feminine touch to it, that a female sympathizer um, smuggles in money, pays off some of the guards, and smuggles in a federal uniform. And during that jailbreak, not only Powell, but two or three other Confederates who are being held as prisoners of war will escape.
For everybody listening, Pennsylvania College at the time, that would be Gettysburg College today.
That's right.
And if you're one of the parents out there who are sending Gettysburg College an enormous annual tuition, God bless you. But that's where Powell was. So he's in Gettysburg until September, goes to Baltimore with the help of Maggie Branson, escapes. What happens to him from there?
So from there, what we do know is that he stays with the Bransons in Baltimore, Maryland, and they owned a boarding house. Mrs. Branson, so there's Mrs. Branson. She has two daughters, Mary and Maggie. Maggie is 30, I think at the time Mary was like 32-ish. And they run this boarding house. Mr. Branson is always away on business in Richmond. Where have we heard all this
Richmond.
before?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Sounds like the Surratt boarding house, doesn't it? Like, anyway, so he'll end up staying with the Bransons for a few days, and then after that, some of where he goes is a bit of a mystery. What is known is that he will travel down to Warrenton, Virginia. Some people will say he's trying to catch up with the Floridians, trying to get back to them. He's trying to follow. Uh, Others will say he's making his way, and that's when he'd start to Richmond to start his Secret Service, whatever. A lot of people have these ideas about what he was doing. What is known is that he does hook up with Mosby's Rangers,
Mm-hmm.
and we have proof of this um, because John W. Munson will provide evidence of this during his trial, and afterwards we'll talk about him. And he will say he was always keyed for any new sensation. He was a first-class fighting man, and he was always ready for any duty and game. We also have on a Company B muster, and this is between October 1863 and December 1863, a Private Powell was signed for a uniform.
Okay.
And that's the last time he will be known as Powell. Um, it's very interesting to me that while he was in Warrenton, Virginia, he stayed with the Payne family.
Mm-hmm.
He's traveling through, they welcome this Confederate soldier traveling through into their home, and he stays there for a while. And as a lot of you know, Mosby's Rangers aren't really stay put. They travel here, there, and everywhere. And he will go back to the Payne family several times and stay with them. And he adopts that name later on when it seems like he's a little bit more undercover,
Yeah.
um, which I guess he really took a liking to the family. He also, and this is the last time we see him with Mosby's Rangers, he's credited with the Rangers that will capture Captain Blazer. And any of our cavalry and our cavalry scout fans out there will know that he was an extremely important scout out in like the West Virginia area. And the two Captains Blazers scouts would kind of duel back and forth with Mosby's Rangers. And Powell will be in those Rangers who is credited with capturing him and taking him to Richmond, where he becomes a prisoner.
You've portrayed a contradictory portrayal of a guy here yesterday. You talked about him being Doc Powell, intending to sick animals and beloved by his family. And I know, from my own readings on the Lincoln assassination, the Powell family has tended to portray him that way. Yet you also have these accounts of a dedicated Confederate fighter, both when he was in the Army of Northern
Mhm.
Virginia and when he was with Mosby's Rangers. I think I've read one account where somebody actually referred to him as Lewis the Terrible. Am I remembering that correctly? For his
Yeah,
ferocity with the Rangers.
they will. And there's one story about him drinking, and I think this comes from his defense attorney.
Okay.
Um, I think this comes from his defense attorney, Captain Doster, trying to portray that Powell, while he is guilty of this crime, is turned from this very average, normal farm boy to a butcher. And he will
Yeah.
actually say that from boy to butcher. And he talks about how kind he was, and then he's he serves for 2 years, and he's in some of the fiercest battles. I mean, we've talked about a lot of
Yeah.
those battles on our podcast, and they're horrible.
Gettysburg's folks, right? Gettysburg.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then how he's with Mosby's Rangers, and for better or worse, whether you're a Mosby fan or not, they're killers. They're out there to go get the other scouts, other Rangers. And he talks about how this boy is turned into this man who's a butcher, and how unfortunately, and this is all of his defense, you can read it, I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
He's a victim of circumstances, that he's just like any private, whether Union or Confederate, could be found guilty of the same crime.
Okay.
He doesn't say it, but he infers it. And I think that's interesting. He talks about how there were plots to kill Jefferson Davis. We all know about that terrible thing that goes wrong, and how, you know, this is another private or another younger soldier who is caught up in the same kind of thing, where he lists 3 points in his defense of him. That one is that he's a Southerner. He's exposed to that way of thinking at a young age. Two, he believes that he's doing something for his country and killing, in his eyes, an oppressor. And that, the surrender was only a few days before this happens. And yeah, so he also brings up the Branson thing several times without saying it, because we're talking about Victorian times where you're not going to say that a woman seduces a man into killing, but he does talk about the influences of going to Baltimore, Maryland, and all those influences on him, and the home that he's staying in, all those influences on
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because by the time he kills or attempts to kill Seward, he's only 21.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's from his own defense attorney. So yeah, and they even bring in people. There is a Mrs. Grant who will testify that in front of her house, uh, the Christmas holiday, she talks about it being in December. She doesn't know an actual date, that he will be with a group of soldiers, assuming that's Mosby's Rangers, and there are Union soldiers being captured, and she doesn't say who, but she does identify Powell in court. She says Powell steps in when those Union soldiers are going to be basically, I guess, killed on the spot rather than taken prisoner, and doesn't allow it to happen.
Okay. All right.
And so that's a test of, she testifies, and that's Mrs. Grant during his trial. So you have all these people speaking up to how wonderful he is, and then he turns around and, like, he wounds at least 5 people
Well, yeah,
within a
let's
matter of
get
minutes.
yeah, so why don't we get to the assassination? So how does this wonderful victim of circumstances go from Mosby to hooking up with
Yeah.
John Wilkes Booth? You want to go there?
All right. So he leaves Richmond and heads back to Baltimore.
Okay.
So apparently, for most of the end of the winter and early spring, he will spend time with the Bransons, but this time he seems to be very sweet on the older sister, Mary. He's into
For
older,
him. Hey, he likes the ladies.
he
Good for
likes the
Powell.
ladies, the older women, and they will be
Or they like
seen.
him.
Yeah, he from about January until April, he will be seen with both Branson sisters escorting them, but mostly Mary. And they will travel back and forth to Washington, D.C. They'll travel back and forth to different spots within Baltimore. And most of the spots they're seen traveling to are of other Southern sympathizers. Now, during this time, you know how the newspapers are much like TV today. If you're watching those shows at night still who gossip, they will say that they are engaged to be married. So from the winter of 1865 until about the middle of March to the end of March, because something happens, he will be seen at the Branson home a lot, escorting both daughters, but specifically the older daughter, Mary. And all the newspapers are saying that they're to be engaged. There's all these rumors. And then at the trial, they will interview one of the maids of the Bransons, and this is what she says. She will say, quote, "The daughter of Mrs. Branson would get up at midnight and serve Powell his meals and pay all kinds of attention to him." So that's what he's doing from the winter of 1865 till the middle of March. He unfortunately, and he's traveling back and forth from DC, and most people assume that it's during this time that he will meet other Southern sympathizers. He will become, I guess, enamored by Booth.
Okay.
We don't exactly know when. Nobody knows when he met him, but he will show up at the Surratt house in the end of March. He will start making friends with those people. On March 13th, there's an incident at the boarding house. He has an altercation with a maid at the boarding house. And this is the first time we see him like lose it and become violent. And he whips a maid at the boarding house. And even though you're in Maryland, that's not okay.
Yeah.
She
Not
is
okay anywhere, we hope, right?
no, but I mean she's a person of color. She is not a
Yeah.
slave, but she is but she does go to the police and she reports it. They come pick him up. They I think because of the difference in the races, they do let him go, but they make him take an oath of allegiance.
Okay.
Um, and there's a copy of that oath of allegiance that's signed in March, and but he doesn't sign it Powell. He signs it Payne.
Right.
And he's
Right.
also going by the name of Longfellow. All the people at the boarding house call him Longfellow. So that's interesting because it's at that time that he leaves the Branson boarding house and he starts making visits to the Surratt boarding house in DC. So that's basically the last time the Bransons say that they see him. That's when we know he starts appearing at the boarding house. And then the only other time that he's seen with Booth or acknowledges the fact that he met with him and the group of conspirators, minus Mary, of course, is the day of the attacks on April 14th.
Lincoln's last speech from the
Hmm.
North Portico of the White House. Lincoln comes out there and
Right.
he starts talking about suffrage in Louisiana. And Powell is in attendance in that speech with Booth.
Booth.
And Booth supposedly becomes so enraged that Booth supposedly turns to Powell and says, that's it. By God, I'll run him through. So there's some indication that might be even
Hmm.
when what had previously been a kidnapping plot starts turning more towards
And
murder and
that's
assassination.
that's late May, March, early
April
April.
11th, we're getting into that window
Hmm.
now of the last days.
Well, and a lot of historians and even his Reverend Gillette, who he speaks with, and even uh, Captain Williams, who will become close with him. He's a detective, and then even his defense attorney, they all claim that some of them don't out and say it, but they all claim that I don't think he was totally aware of the magnitude of the attacks. I think up until that day, he thought it was still a kidnapping,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
then it was kind of too
yeah.
late.
Yeah, and you're right. If I remember correctly, there's conflicting versions where he says he didn't realize it was going to turn into an assassination until the morning of. Other people say,
The
that afternoon.
afternoon.
That
Mhm.
we now turn to an assassination plot. He has to have some level of John Wilkes Booth's confidence to be given
Right.
such an important role, right? Because you have Booth, you have John Surratt, and then you have Powell getting a really important assignment. You want to talk about how that develops?
Well, and the way I look at it is they
Hmm.
know his service record.
Okay.
So they don't know how they became friends. They also thought that perhaps he met him when he went to Richmond when he turned in Captain Blazer. But I mean, they know his record. They're using him to be, I guess, the heavy or the killer of the group. I mean, if you think about it, Booth has never, he's an actor,
Right. What do actors know, right?
right?
Right. Right.
I mean, so that's now he's seen several times at the Surratt house. And
Well, do you want to take us to the night of the assassination? And let's do it.
yeah,
Well,
yeah, because so much before that point is unknown. I mean,
yeah.
they found things in his pockets, like there's a number of a woman from where he met Booth that afternoon that places him there.
Okay.
She was, I guess, the room number of a woman. So I don't know. I guess he did like the ladies.
We seem to
Um,
keep gravitating towards that. Is that the
I
sub-theme of
know.
this
I
episode?
guess that's part between Booth and the ladies. He it was his downfall. Well, he's a tragic person, Jim. He's tragic. But he does, so he goes to Seward's house, and on him, he's there with another conspirator. He's riding a horse because I know there's lots of stories about how, he has his horse. There's stories about how he didn't have a way to get away, but he does have his horse. He has a very large knife and he has a Whitney with him, which will not go off.
Yeah.
Maybe at this point, do we want to talk about the house that he goes to? I feel like this is an unlucky house.
Jody, what a great segue into this edition of the Dan Sickles Report, right?
Yay!
Yay, yay. So okay, let's talk about this, folks, what we're alluding to. And thank you, Jody, for that opening there. We Secretary of State William Seward has been injured in a carriage accident, but he is living in a home on fashionable and prestigious Lafayette Square. Right behind the White House, 1859 Lafayette Square was the other side of the square. Was the home of Congressman Dan Sickles. And the murder of Philip Barton Key in February of 1859 took place in Lafayette Square. Well, the specific house that Seward is now staying in 1865, in 1859, at the time of the Sickles Key affair, in 1859, this house was a boarding house, and one of the people who took up residence in the boarding house was Philip Barton Key. So after Sickles shot Key in cold blood or in self-defense, depending on your interpretation of that case, Key
Defending
was
his home
defending his home and
and
his
his
hurt,
wife.
right? Right. Depending on your interpretation, in any event, Key was taken back into this boarding house in Lafayette Square. Key was placed on the floor of one of the rooms on the ground floor, and Philip Barton Key died in that house. Died in the same house that Secretary of State Seward will be staying in on this historic night in April 1865. There's even one account I've read, Jody, where when the Sewards were talking about renting out this house, somebody had reportedly told them, "Don't do it. The house is cursed. Philip Barton Key died in that house." I have seen that account. But in any event, folks, that's this edition of the Dan Sickles Report. Okay, Jody, so it's the night of the assassination. Powell arrives at William Seward's front door in fashionable Lafayette Square. Take us to that front door, and what does Powell do?
So he arrives around 10 o'clock, and I guess this is where we could probably bring in the trench coat, right? Because
Okay.
that's the main thing about him that identifies him and puts him everywhere after this incident and where they find all the contents in his pocket. He's dressed in that famous trench coat that's like a tannish beige color, whitish color, and that slouch hat. He is pretending to deliver medications to Seward. We said that he was severely injured in a carriage wreck, right? And he's got a neck brace on, he's bedridden. He will push past the doorman who questions why he's there and doesn't want to admit him. He will encounter, I guess, Freddie or his son, Seward's son, Frederick, on the stairs. He does pistol whip him over the head, whether it's
Yeah.
because the gun doesn't go off or whatever, but that's what happens. And then he will burst his way into the room. There's a bodyguard there. I guess that's George Robinson. And
Hmm.
he slashes at him and injures him. Fanny at this time will get up. He will push her, I guess, down or across the room. And then he slashes at Seward. That's when the attack happens, cutting him in the face, the neck, trying to get through
Right.
that neck brace, which I guess kind of saves his life
Yeah,
at that
because
point.
Powell has smashed his gun on Freddie Seward's head. All he's
Right.
got is this knife.
So at about the same time that the incident at Ford's Theater is happening, what is that,
Hmm.
like 10:15-ish,
Hmm.
the other son, Augustus Henry Seward, will arrive. And I guess at this time, Powell will attack him and then make his escape. He will leave. Um, and it's interesting because at this time, this trained killer that we've talked about hasn't killed anybody.
Well, yeah.
I don't know. I find
Okay.
that
All right. No,
interesting.
that's okay. Hey, different interpretations.
Yeah. He
So,
attacks everybody. So
well,
he will jump on his horse.
yeah, and I just want to go back to that
Yeah.
earlier point. Yeah, whether he's killed anybody or not, he's just basically beaten the hell out of a house full of people. This is a big, ferocious guy,
Right.
armed and dangerous, right? And remember too, as he comes out of the house, he's supposedly shouting, "I'm mad, I'm mad." What do you think, based on your research? What do you think the real mental state of this guy is? Because I know later when he's incarcerated during the trial, there's going to be some attempt to determine whether or not they think he's insane or
Right.
not. But what do you think's going on with this guy?
I think at this point, and guys, folks watching, Jim and I are not mental health professionals.
We're not. We could be.
We're not.
You can be anything you want to be on
Right.
YouTube. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah, right.
We
No,
have
but
studied we have studied the Dan Sickles case ad nauseum. That
yes,
means something. Temporary
yes, we
insanity.
both have. We both said we both love true crime, and there you go.
Hmm.
Uh, no, I think up until this point we talk about him, you know, really serving his country. We're not going to get into that, but serving his country, loving animals, taking care of his sisters, wanting to be a minister, you know, caring for wounded, defending these two defenseless soldiers. And now you have him attacking, and I did just say that he didn't kill them, but he could have, and it was close. So my thought is it's almost like a break at this point. He's like, wow, I just attacked unarmed people.
Okay. Okay.
I, that's what I think. I think it's an act of remorse, a you know, a declaration of remorse at that point. I don't think he understood what he was doing until he did it. Again, and that's what his defense attorney tries to say. Yes, he did it. We're not saying he didn't. But he's been in the army. He's been in the military from 17 until almost 21 in war. And now, basically we've turned him into this, and believe it or I don't know. That was his defense.
Okay.
Now, what does happen after this is he does not get lost. Um, the when he is captured and when his horse is recovered, because they do recover his horse separate from him, um, his horse will have wounds on it and dirt on its knees as if it went down. And he will say in the escape that something happened. His horse went down. He fell off his horse. And he will sit in a tree for the 3 days between the 14th and the 17th until he makes it back to the Surratt house.
Yeah, tell us that story because it's one of the interesting stories of the whole Lincoln assassination. How does young Powell get captured? It's an interesting
It's
story.
he has really bad timing.
Yeah, yeah.
Like super bad timing. I'm assuming, which unfortunately this implicates Mary Surratt, but I'm assuming he's going back there because he's lost his horse. Um, where he was supposed to escape to is, now it's 3 days later. So I'm assuming he's going there to see what has happened. He hasn't been reading the papers. He's been hiding out. I'm assuming he's going there to find a safe haven to hide
Yeah.
out, to
Yeah.
get somewhere else.
Agreed.
But just as he arrives, that is the same time as you know, investigators arrive there to take her and question the entire family about Booth and their involvement in the entire thing. So it's just very bad timing. He claims that he's there to do work for her, and which I think if she had just played along with that would have been better for her and him, but she doesn't. She says,
Right.
I've never seen him before in my life, but there's people in the house who are there also saying, "Oh no, we have seen him before." So it just the entire thing turns into a mess, and that's how he's captured.
Okay.
And, and at that point, he goes willingly.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. And then
But,
sort of in the interest of time here, transition us over to his
oh,
incarceration and the trial.
well, unfortunately for him, he is kept on the monitor, the Saugus, and that's how if we're going to pivot back to Alexander Gardner gets those pictures of him on April 27th. Um, they're fascinating pictures. Like basically, he's the only one who's photographed so much and so intently. Um, for the first, I guess, for a long time, they're not permitted to bathe, I think, until like May 4th. No baths. They're kept on no chairs. They're shackled. There's those manacles which you can't move independently. Uh, and then, unfortunately for him, he will try to commit suicide by banging his head against the walls of the Saugus of the monitor. And at that point, they make those padded hooded that we see them all appearing in all the time,
Hmm.
and they will make him wear his 24 hours a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the captain that he becomes well, not friends with, but actually does talk to, Captain Williams, will say that he will cry all the time when they put it on and off because it's suffocating. It's and there's a story that I don't know if people know. He carried, and it was found on him in his personal belongings when he's captured at the Surratt house, a little pin cushion, or, one of those little mother's helpers that soldiers and privates will keep in the field. And he has had that since he left home when he was 17. His mother made it for him, and he will ask if he can have it back. And they will finally give it back to him because they're afraid of his mental state.
Okay.
So he will have that up until the last day, which I think is, again, we have this hardened man who attacks five people, but he's crying and trying to kill himself and wants this little piece of what his mother gave him.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, as you pointed out,
Yeah.
hardened physically, hardened mentally, but at the end of the day, still a kid. At least
Yeah.
certainly by modern standards, maybe not
Right.
as much by 1865, but we would think of him as a kid.
Right.
Ultimately, what is his defense, and is he cooperative with his defense attorney? Does he play along, or what's his state during these last sort of days and weeks?
He doesn't really have a defense attorney until later on.
Okay.
He doesn't really talk to anybody or really help himself. He's very solemn, he's very quiet. Like I said, he tried to hurt himself, kill himself. Eventually, they do assign Captain Doster, who was really not there for him. And he doesn't share a lot of information. What he does share is he tries to get Mary Surratt. He says that she really didn't know what was going on either. So, I mean, did she not know that they were going to kill people? It was more of a kidnapping. Probably, I don't know. That seems to be his sole kind of focus when he's questioned. And again, I'm paraphrasing.
Hmm.
Um, and which is interesting to me because then there he's showing this soft side again. They will, um, and this is very smart of his defense attorney, he will require that his mental state be examined and they find him fit to stand trial. But even back then, the newspapers will Some of them portray him as this butcher. Others portray him as this like simpleton kind of boy who's mentally challenged. But then we have examples of where he's written poetry to women while he was staying with the Paynes down in Warrenton, Virginia. And his parents were teachers and ministers, so he could read and write.
Hmm.
So I guess there's still a lot of unknown, and I just it's in the end it's just very sad. So
Yeah.
he's found he's the only one during his trial too who will still be hooded and doesn't really, and once they do take it off, he just doesn't really say anything. He
Okay.
just sits
Okay.
and,
Any
and stares away. He doesn't speak on his own behalf. He doesn't really now the one thing he does is when he's the executioner takes him up to the gallows, he'll just say, "I thank you and goodbye." And he unfortunately, uh, the rest of the conspirators that perished that day, most of them will just die pretty much instantly. It will take 5 minutes for him to die. He will fight for 5 minutes, which is pretty
yeah, pretty
sad.
characteristic based on what we've learned of the guy.
Right,
I'm not surprised to hear
right.
that.
And I think I wouldn't say the fun part about this is again, I'm not an expert. We started down this little rabbit hole of Powell because of his connection with the Floridians, and
Hmm.
not a lot of people know that he was there. So
Hmm.
it's
And we
it's
like
interesting to
true
look at
crime.
these.
Yeah.
Right, right. Interesting to look at these individual soldiers. And I'm sure something I said today will probably be disputed because I think, and you and I both, there's like 5 accounts that say he was wounded on the 2nd, 5 that say July 3rd. There's people who claim that he was this, he was that. Like, so even after he died, there was, and we know about that, there's accounts later, oh, he did this, oh, he was nice, oh, he was horrible. So I think just because of who he was and because he kept things so secret, there's a lot of misunderstanding, which makes it even more fun.
And you got to remember too, the Lincoln
Right.
assassination is
Uh,
like Gettysburg, like Little Bighorn, JFK, Lincoln assassination is one of those
right,
heavily studied fields, and you're going to have a lot of experts out there. And as you said, may agree, may not agree
right.
with some of what we're doing. But we started this from the Gettysburg perspective. You
Hmm.
touched on something though a few minutes ago about not necessarily resting in peace. You maybe want to put a bow on the episode talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, so he all the conspirators are buried there that died that day. And just for time, they're moved several times. And at one point, their families are not allowed to come get their bodies. And then because so his family does try one time. Then after that, when they are allowed to come get their bodies, um, I'm not sure at that point whether his family doesn't know because they're in Florida. However, his body will end up after about after several moves in Rock Creek Cemetery. His head will start off with the part of not together, but the same location at the Army Medical Museum with Booth's part of his spine that they have there.
And what was it one time? The home of Dan Sickles' severed leg. So there's Dan
See,
Sickles' report number two.
there you go, two Sickles reports. However, at some point, I don't know when, his skull will leave and go to the Smithsonian, and some God bless, people who work at the Smithsonian because they realized that this skull should not have been with the other skulls it was with. They noticed the markings on it. And then I think I talked earlier about him having a pet mule and loving animals. When he was a young child, he was kicked
Hmm.
and broke his jaw. So his skull was identified because there was a K on it, and a P, and there's some other identifying marks on it. And then there was also a broken area on the skull from being kicked by that mule. So now, if you want to go see his skull's final resting place, it is in Geneva, the Geneva Cemetery in Florida.
And is that with the rest is that in the same place as the rest of the body, or are they in separate
No,
places right now?
his body is still in Rock Creek
They're in different places.
Cemetery.
Okay. All right.
So
All right.
he's still an anomaly. He's still,
An enigma,
yeah,
right?
still an enigma. He's still very separate in who he was and what he did, and we're still not sure about him.
I always say Gettysburg, you got 160,000 participants,
Yeah,
160,000 potential stories, but Lewis Powell would definitely be up there among one of the more unique and ultimately, because of April
right.
1865, one of the more historically important stories.
Most
Yeah.
people don't know that.
Yeah.
Most people don't even know that Florida was there.
Well, they don't, and that kind of brings us full circle back to the beginning of this, which started
Mhm.
out on the field in the wind and the approaching rain with Perry's Florida Brigade, which was commanded at Gettysburg by
Mhm.
Colonel David Lang. So, Jody, what I'm going to do for a minute is just kind of put a bookend on Colonel Lang because I talked about him when we were on the
Right.
field. I read some passages from his report to try to get an idea of what that brigade was going through. David Lang, fortunately, had a much happier ending than Lewis Powell did. Lang would survive Gettysburg. He would survive the Civil War. He would return to Gettysburg at least once that we know of in 1895 to help stake out potential locations for a Florida monument. As we learned yesterday, though, the Florida monument, for various reasons, did not end up on the field until the 1960s. So Colonel David Lang died in 1917. Unlike Lewis Powell, Colonel Lang lived a long and relatively fulfilling life. He died in 1917, and he was among the last brigade commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia to perish. So that's sort of our bookend
Wow.
on Colonel Lang. So Colonel Lang commanded the brigade. Lewis Powell obviously served under him at the common soldier level. And folks, again, that's one of the reasons why we study Gettysburg, because there's so many different ways to look at this. Jody, any closing thoughts? We've gone from the field to here in the studios. Any closing thoughts on your guy Lewis Powell?
No, I guess my whole take on this is whether you like him or not, or whether you like a certain soldier or not, you really have to appreciate what they went through and how it changes them.
Yeah, fair enough. And probably
Hmm.
because PTSD and things like that of that
Right.
nature were not formally studied back in the day. Probably something that we really don't appreciate
Hmm.
when studying these Civil War soldiers.
Yeah. And they keep stressing how young he was. And when we're studying this, I don't know, in my mind, I'm always picturing these men fighting and they're like 17, 18, 19, 20.
Mhm.
They're just
Okay.
starting their life.
All
So,
right, folks. With that,
yeah.
we're going to wrap up this installment of the Battle of Gettysburg podcast on YouTube. This has been Jim and Jody, who's really taken over today and led us on that fascinating Lewis Powell journey. Jody, thanks for taking time to do this.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, yeah. And folks, again, like and subscribe Battle of Gettysburg podcast on YouTube and wherever you devour your favorite podcasts. But we're going to sign off for now, and we will see you on the battlefield hopefully soon.